Can you hear me? Okay, so I don't forget this. In your lesson books, on page 10, the second set of questions where it goes to question 3, it says, what advice is found in chapter 25, verse 17? That is incorrect. It is 26, 1 through 10. Chapter 26, 1 through 10, on question 3, where it says, what advice is found in chapter 25, verse 17? So cross out 25, 17 and put in 26, 1 through 10. Okay, I'm off the hook now. So, before we get started tonight, Hardy, would you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the ability to be here. We're thankful for the freedoms that we have. We're thankful for this time that we can come together with our brothers and sisters in Christ. We can be here to encourage each other, help each other learn. We ask your blessing upon Shawn as he leads the class. Help us all to have open hearts and open minds, ready to listen and understand your word. Let us have the wisdom to use it and to apply it to our lives and to share it wherever we can. Bless all who cannot be here this evening because of sickness or age or just not here because of indifference. There's something we can do to encourage them, help them, whatever we can. Thankful for your Son and all the blessings we have through him. We ask all these things through his name. Amen.
Amen. As we look at tonight's lesson, we're going to talk about injustice, lying, drinking, and evil companions. Injustice, when we look at this, there's a passage in Micah 6:8. Micah 6:8, it says, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. As we go to Proverbs here in the first one, injustice. Injustice, the word means it's a lack of fairness. And I think a lack of fairness can take on many different ways that can play out. Let's look at a couple of these passages here. Proverbs 20, verse 10. Do I have a volunteer to read that? Proverbs 20, verse 10.
False weights and differing measures are alike, both are disgusting to the eternal.
Okay. And then let's look at Proverbs 20, verse 14. So,
Bad, said the buyer, but when he goes away, then he boasts.
about that bargain that he got. You know, he took advantage of somebody, but I got a great deal. When we look at weights and measures, it made me think of, as a store manager for Walmart, all of a sudden I'd get a call, weights and measures is here. And then you go up front to the registers, and then they bring in a kit, and it's got all different weights. And then you literally, he is there all day long. He checked every scale, at the registers throughout the whole store. Then he went to where like your meat and your produce and all that and checked the scales there. And then he would take your packages, and whatever the weight of the package was, when you put that on the scale, that had to be taken off, because you're not to pay for that. And as he broke that down, there was times, and your fines could be rather hefty if he thought that you were deliberately being unfair. So I would spend all day with it, then I'd have to write up a report, and I'd have to send it to my boss, and I had to call my boss when they showed up, and then I had to call him halfway through the day, how's it going, you know, and because everything is weighed, they want to be sure that you as a company are being fair and just. And if they thought you were being unfair and just, the fines that they would levy against you would be substantial. So I think it goes back to what's being talked about here in Proverbs 20:23. It says, different weights are detestable, an offense to the Lord. Fraudulent scales are not good. I can remember going to another store and we were doing an inventory prep. And we weren't checking the weights and the scales on the front register in the perishable department, but they had a fabric department. And on the table for the fabric department, one of the guidelines was that we were to have a yardstick there. And so my job was to go through and help, and you had to roll out all this fabric and measure it, and it was like, I'd rather been waiting the meat or something, you know, but the fabric was, And then I remember having a yardstick with me, and I had a brand new yardstick, and I put it down on the table, and the one on the table was like a 1/4 inch short. And then all of a sudden I said, whoa, we've got to change this. And the guy goes, well, it's been this way forever. And I said, that doesn't matter. And he goes, well, what about all those other people we take that up? We're saying we know we took advantage of them. I said, I don't think any of us knew it was short, but we now know it's short. We have to change it because that's the right thing to do. So I think it can take on a lot of different avenues when you start looking at being fair and right and what's just and not taking advantage of somebody. Let's look at Proverbs 21:7. Do I have a volunteer for that, to read that? Hardy.
The violence of the wicked will sweep them away because they refuse to do what is just.
I had it, if you never, I found this version of the Bible, it's called an Amplified. And I love how it puts things, especially as you're studying Proverbs and you're really trying to get the meaning of what they're talking about. And it says, the violence of the wicked will return to them, drag them away like a fish caught in a net, because they refuse to act with justice. So they get caught by their evil deeds. It comes back and they end up paying the penalty. They think they're going to get away with it up front, but it always comes back and gets them. So as you look at someone who has that mindset, to me, it's their bent or sole thought is, how can I take advantage of you to my good? And I think at times, if we aren't careful, you start to accept that is part of a normal type of behavior instead of realizing it's evil. And I think sometimes today, to me, it's like years ago, I would sit in a business meeting and you would never hear people use profanity. 25 years ago, it was unprofessional, it wasn't called for. Now, you can't sit through a meeting without somebody using the F word. And I mean, and it's just, it's become accepted. And I think that's where it's really wrong. And when we look at injustice, to me, it's a mindset. If I'm going to take advantage of people, I'm strictly worried about what's good for me and not anybody else. And as Christians, obviously, we're not to be that way. Let's look at Proverbs 22:16. And it says, he who oppresses or exploits the poor, and I'm reading from the Amplified, to get more for himself, or he gives to the rich to gain influence or favor, will only come to poverty. I once had a boss when we were in Michigan, and Sue and I worked for like a Kroger. And my boss came in, and he had gotten a big promotion, and we're sitting there talking, and and he told me he just bought this fancy house in the rich end of town, and we're sitting there talking, and I said, oh, okay. And something came up about where we went to church, and I said, well, I go to church up in a little town just north of Rockford, Michigan, and I mean, it was Cedar Springs, and there was 4 of us who worshiped there. And he goes, why would you do that? And I said, well, where are you worshiping? And he goes, well, this church in town has all the rich and influenced people. And he goes, so I go there because I'm trying to build those relationships. And then a few months later, I said, well, how's that going for you? And he goes, they really don't want to have too much to do with me. And I'm sitting there going, I knew I couldn't read him this passage, but it was like, okay. So I think it goes back to the thought of the heart and the mind. It's not about serving God or not about doing what's the right thing. He's manipulating the scenario to his best, what he believes will be his best outcome. And whoever he hurts in the process of that doesn't really enter into his mindset or thought process. So to me, as we look at that, when we look at each other and the people we interact with, we should be a night and day difference from what's being portrayed here and how we as Christians should live. Because it's not about taking advantage of others, it's helping and loving and being fair and just. Let's look at Proverbs 22, verses 22 through 23. Do I have a volunteer to read that? Proverbs 22, 22, and 23. Mike.
Do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. For the Lord will plead their case, and take the life of those who rob them.
Have you ever seen somebody who had the thought process, I can take advantage of this situation, so I'm going to do so, even though they know the other person is not very well off or struggling, and if they can manipulate it to their own good, they do so? I've seen that, watched that, tried to stop that, and it's you walk away and you just feel like, and you end up, go ahead, Artie.
I just think of all these scams that they try to get on these elderly people and stuff like that, you know, it's just sickening that someone would take advantage of someone like that, and Lord's gonna repay them one day, but it's just, you hate to see, sometimes, you know, I've seen loved ones get kind of taken advantage of.
Well, we've had to tell our mom, my brothers and I, if somebody calls you and they're trying to promote something, stop, call us, and tell us what's going on. And all of us like, nope, cut it off. Just don't go there. But you're right. And that's what I told her. And she started to get taken advantage of once. And I said, good Lord is going to level the playing field here. So, Bruce.
In a recent study, when we look at benevolence, he said if you lend to the poor, God will repay you for that. And it's interesting here, he says if you rob from the poor, God will repay you for that too. So he's looking at both ways how we deal with those who are less fortunate. Covers that in both directions.
And I think as you look at this, it's not to be unjust with people. I think takes a heart of compassion. It takes a heart of love, which we as Christians are to love our fellow man. We're trying to give them the gift of Christianity. We're to teach fairness. I remember once my dad borrowed a piece of equipment from the next door neighbor, and it broke. And my dad went out and bought, not a used one, but bought a brand new one. And he gave it back to me because in that situation, he trusted me with his equipment. And I said, but Dad, it's old. And he goes, that's not the point. He goes, he should not suffer a loss because of my using something. He goes, we weren't doing anything wrong with it. It just like gave up the ghost. It was done. And it's lessons like that that I think we as parents have to teach. You know, if someone's going to come up on the short end of the stick on something, you'd rather be at you and be sure the other person is really taken care of. Do good to them. And I think that's an important lesson is we look at this, don't oppress the poor, do good to them, give your best to everyone that you come into account with, and you should be going overboard to prove all things are honest in the sight of all men. I guess is the best way to say it. And I think as Christians, that's the world should see that in us and see that behavior in us, that it's very important that we are fair and just and we don't take advantage of somebody. Other thoughts, other comments? Bruce?
I just kind of put this to sum it up for that God just doesn't tolerate those who gain at the expense of others.
Exactly.
So I need to be careful that I'm not putting myself in that position.
Thank you. Let's go to our second one on lying. What does it mean to tell a lie? If you had kids, and as our boys were young, I can remember trying to describe to them what lying was. How would you describe that to your kids so that they understand, don't tell a lie?
Mishandling the truth.
It's what?
Mishandling the truth.
Mishandling the truth. Is there other aspects that come up that would be considered lying? Or deception. Other thoughts? Carrie.
Leading someone to believe something that isn't true, either through your words or your actions, or by only telling part of a truth, or by, there's so many aspects.
There is. I can remember once with the boys, they were 5 and 3, and I think Zach had been born at that time. And something came up, and I punished one of the boys. Well, then the longer I sat there and listened, I didn't have the whole story. And I felt bad for punishing one of the boys because I based my decision on incorrect information. And so I had to try to teach them that when you withhold something and you don't tell the whole story, that's like lying. You're not being straightforward and coming out with everything that transpired. And I think lying can take on many different facets or angles, as kind of like what Carrie's talking about. And we as Christians, I remember having a wrestling coach, and we were sitting there, and the team that we just finished wrestling with, they clobbered us, and their coach offered to help us. He was an Olympic wrestler, the other team's coach was, and they always took the state championship. And we stunk. We were awful. We just were horrible. And the coach the Olympic wrestling coach said, he goes, hey, if you guys want to come over, you're not that far from our school, we can have a lot of practices together, and I can do everything I can to help you. I can tell you really want a good program. And my coach is sitting there, and he goes, well, we're kind of busy right now with some other things, and I'm sitting there going, I don't remember that being on the schedule, you know? And all of a sudden, we're walking to the bus, and I said, why did you tell him that we had all these other things going on? And he goes, it's a little white lie. Those are okay. And I'm sitting there, and I said, a lie's a lie, isn't it? And he goes, little white lies are okay. And I'm sitting there walking away to the bus. I'm like, that's not what my folks told me, you know? My folks said, you know, if you misrepresent the truth, it's a lie, and the lie is wrong. So I think realizing that it's extremely important that we be very truthful and honest. And I've heard people say, whoops, wait a minute, that's not quite true. And then they retract what they said, and here's what it really happened. Or, wait a minute, let me change that because that's not accurate. And I appreciate that, you know. Let's look at Proverbs 19:5. It says, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells a lie will not escape. Have you ever been around somebody who lies all the time? And if you really listen to their conversations, even in the lie they just told, they contradict something else they've already said. And then when you ask for clarification, then it's another lie, and then another lie. And so I think to me, when you sit there, number one, I think they're going to be punished here on earth because everybody's sitting there going, liar, 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 you can't trust them. And then once you break trust with people, a lot of other things start to fall apart. But I also sit there and think that God is going to hold them accountable for those lies. And somebody who's a liar, and I just think the smart thing to do, put some distance there between yourself. Evil companions corrupt good morals. Just don't hang around with people who are that type of person who just lie, because eventually it comes out on you. Let's look at Proverbs 19:9. It says, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will perish. It's pretty simple and straightforward. If you're a liar, you're going to end up in that very uncomfortable place called hell. And I think that's the importance of just being truthful and honest, Kenneth.
God said he'll punish all liars.
Mm-hmm. I would, after going through this study, I really want to throw this out as a challenge to all of us. If we were to sit down and you look at like Galatians 5, the works of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit. And I think sometimes we read over those so quickly that we miss things. And then there's a passage in, let's see if I got it here with me. First Timothy 3, 1-5. And the lying got me going down this thought process. But if you look at 1 Timothy 3, and let's look at verses 1-5. I mean, 2 Timothy. No, 1 Timothy 3. I'm sorry. No, that's 2 Timothy. I'm sorry. 2 2 Timothy 3, sorry. Yes, 2 Timothy 3, sorry. And it says, but realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable. What does that word mean? Irreconcilable. Can't fix it or won't fix it. Right? And I think it's interesting how, if you don't slow it down and really think about what these words mean, we could be acting just like the world. It says, malicious gossip, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasures rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these. So when I look at these, you're talking about, we're talking about injustice, lying, right? These can be, to me, when you are you do something that's unjust to somebody, it's not because you're holy. It's because you're thinking evil. Why would you lie to somebody? Why wouldn't you be straightforward? Because we're starting to act like the world, think like the world. And the hard thing is, to me, when I look at this and I'm sitting there in my family room and I turn on the TV, what do I see? People with irreconcilable differences. Everybody's right. That side's wrong. I'm right, you know. And the best interest of the people they're supposed to be representing doesn't even come into play. I'm not pro-Democrat, pro-Republican. I just think politics is a dirty business. So, and it's as far as from Christianity as it can get. So it makes me think of that. That's what I see. And then I sit there, and I'm probably like most of you. I look at my family, and I look at what we're trying to do, and I feel blessed that I have this that never changes. God's word never changes, which helps me stay away from what we're talking about tonight, if I believe it and put it in my heart and teach it to my kids and stuff, right? So let's look at Proverbs 24 verses 28 and 29. Proverbs 24, 28, and 29. Do I have a volunteer to read that, please? Proverbs 24, 28, and 29. Phil.
Do not be a witness against your neighbor without cause, and do not deceive with your lips. Do not say, thus I shall do to him as he has done to me. I will render to the man according to his work.
As I read this over and over, I remember sitting when I worked at Walmart. We had a department manager who was in trouble and was on the brink of being fired. And I'm talking to him, and I'm trying to understand what transpired. And he goes, well, his boss, he goes, Lee was right there through this whole conversation with this person. And I said, okay. And he goes, but this isn't going to turn out well for me because Lee doesn't like me. And he was right. Lee didn't like him. But I bring Lee in, and then all of a sudden we're sitting there, and he goes, Lee starts it off, he goes, this is really hard for me. And he goes, because I don't like him. He said it right to his face, and I'm like, and he goes, but this is what happened. And he goes, I cannot lie. What he said is 100% accurate. And I'm like, okay, because I'm sitting there thinking, oh, great, they don't like each other. Now it's going to get really muddy, and, you know. But he told the truth. Even though he didn't care for the guy, he said, I cannot tell a lie. I got to be accurate. And you could tell the guy who was in trouble looked at him like, you know, totally surprised that he told the truth. So I think when we look at this, it doesn't mean don't be a witness against your neighbor. If your neighbor did something wrong, tell the truth. If he didn't do it, don't be a false witness, you know. So always be truthful, and, you know, remember that we answer to God. And so being honest and straightforward and always being truthful is extremely important. Make sense? It's not complicated, but we make it complicated. Proverbs 21:28. It says, a false witness will perish, but the man who listens to the truth will speak forever. I can remember as a kid when I go see my grandparents, and my grandfather and another gentleman were elders of the church, and then you'd sit there and then they would talk about things, and I was always just taken back by the way they applied God's word. It was logical, it was lovingly, it was careful, they would always talk about, you know, if we're going to send this message to the congregation, how we go about it, being very truthful and being very straightforward. It impressed me that they put that much thought into it even as a kid. So when I think of a false witness, I think of just the opposite of men in my life who have set that example of being truthful, not misleading people, being the type of person that God would want us to be. Bruce.
I think this passage too shows that the truth will stand, the lie's gonna come out. It's gonna come back on you. But telling the truth is the truth. Can't change it. It's gonna be there. So he says here it'll last forever because it's true.
Yeah. And it's in Dale.
When you tell a lie, you have to remember who you told it to, because they're gonna remember, and if you tell another lie, they're gonna remember that too.
Yeah, it's so true. And I've noticed, have you ever noticed people who lie continually? Have you ever noticed that circle of friends just keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and because you can't trust them, and you don't want to be around somebody that you can't trust, or I say feel safe that they're going to do the right thing by you. So, and I think it's important as we look at these things, as the things that are going on. To me, when I look at where we're at in the world and our society, we're getting farther and farther and farther away from any knowledge of God's word. And I just keep getting more and more astonished that those who have no knowledge of God's word, and then I sit back, and I don't mean this to sound judgmental, but I look at their lives because I have to deal with all the stuff that goes on in their life and why they can't come to work and different things. It's a shambles. Their lives are in ruin. And they don't even know how to fix it. And you try to help them, but they won't even listen. Let's look at drinking. Proverbs 20, verse 1. It says, wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is intoxicated by it is not wise. If anybody, I can remember when I played football, every Monday we'd line up to do our drills. Coach would walk right down the line and look us all in the eye. And he goes, oh, you guys have been out drinking this last weekend, huh? To the hill. And then we go to the hill, and then he goes, every one of you has to pick up somebody heavier than you and run up and down the hill. And those who had been drinking, it'd take like one trip up, one trip down, and then they would be off to the side. But I can remember guys drinking, and then you look at them, and then it's like they'd fight. They would do all sorts of things that just made no sense. Foolish, harmful, life-risking. We had a guy who came in once, and then he was drunk, and then the coach asked him to do something, and he hauled off and punched the coach. Needless to say, he didn't play football anymore, and I'm surprised that there was no assault and battery charges. But when I watch that, I'm sitting there going, why? Right? So, Proverbs 23, verses 20 and 21, it says, do not be with heavy drinkers of wine or gluttonous eaters of meat. And I'm reading from the Amplified again. It says, for heavy drinkers and glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe one with rags. Somebody who is an alcoholic, they spend most of their time looking for the next drink, and then things are falling apart because they're not working, they're missing work, they're not taking care of things at home, so things start to fall apart. It ruins your life. And I mean, that's plain and simple. Other thoughts or comments? Bruce?
It seems like these three passages that it describes a fool and it brings poverty and addiction. That's the outcome consequence.
Yeah. And I've heard people, well, that won't happen to me. I remember as a kid, my aunt and uncle came from Lansing, Michigan to our place in Jenison. And my dad knew my uncle was an alcoholic. And as a kid, they were there to eat a meal and all that. They came with my grandparents. And all of a sudden, about 2 hours into the visit, my dad said, it's time for you guys to go home. And we're all sitting there. My mom's looking like, but the guy, my uncle, had been out to his car 6 times in 2 hours. And every time he came back in, he was a lot happier. And my dad just told him, he said, I'm not going to have this in my house. I don't believe this is right. And I'm not going to have you around my kids. And that made such an impression on me that I think 9, 10 years old, because I didn't realize that's what he was going to the car for. But my dad sure did. And you don't want that around you because It's an addiction, it's destructive. And years later, I remember my dad taking me to the hospital to see him, my uncle, and he literally drank himself to death. Non-Christian, very sad. And my dad goes, I want you to understand this. He goes, I don't mean this in an unloving way. And he goes, this is why God says don't do this stuff. So I think at times we need to take those moments too and use it as not a condescending way, but a teaching moment of the logic and the reasoning of God's word to help our kids, our grandkids. And as you go against this, this is what the outcome can be. So we're out of time. One other passage that you could look at is Proverbs 23, verses 29 through 35. If you want to read that on the outcome of alcohol. Proverbs 23, 29 through 35. Thank you very much.